So before we get into the findings that you presented at WIO, could you walk us through the DAVIO2 trial and what was being tested?
Sure, that's a great question. So, the DAVIO2 trial is a phase 2 randomized control trial that evaluated the safety, efficacy, and durability of EYP-1901, which is a vorolanib intravitreal insert. And basically, this trial had three arms. There was an EYP-1901 2 milligram low dose arm, an EYP-1901 3 milligram high dose arm, and then an aflibercept 2 milligram arm where aflibercept was dosed on label. So in this study, all three arms received three loading doses of aflibercept 2 milligrams. And at the week 8 time point, the two EYP-1901 arms received their dose of EYP-1901, and the aflibercept 2 milligram arm received an additional sham injection in addition to that aflibercept 2 milligram loading dose. And the primary endpoint in this study was looking at mean change in BCVA at month 7 and 8 average. So basically 6 months after the EYP-1901 dose. Throughout the trial, patients were evaluated every 4 weeks. And again, aflibercept 2 milligrams was dosed on label in that arm. And in the other two arms, patients were retreated based on pre-specified retreatment criteria.
What were some of the key findings from the trial?
Great question. So, the primary endpoint that I mentioned, which looked at mean change in BCVA at month 7 and 8 averaged, that primary endpoint was met. So, the change in BCVA was found to be statistically non-inferior with a single EYP-1901 dose compared to aflibercept 2 milligrams dosed every 8 weeks. There was a very, very favorable safety profile. So there was no EYP-1901 related ocular or systemic SAEs, no insert migration into the anterior chamber, no cases of retinal occlusive vasculitis, and over 85% of EYP-1901 treated eyes had stable or improved vision at the time of the primary endpoint assessment. And there was an 85% overall reduction in treatment burden with a single dose of EYP-1901 compared to patients' pre-trial treatment burden. One important factor in this study was that all patients in the DAVIO2 trial were all previously treated patients and on average had received 10 anti-VEGF injections in the year prior to enrolling in the trial. So very high treatment burden patient population. And so that last finding is very important.
Were there any results from the DAVIO2 trial that you found interesting?
So I think there were a lot of interesting results. Obviously, the primary endpoint looked specifically at BCVA, but there were also opportunities to look at anatomical control. And when we think about our traditional anti-VEGF treatment pattern, it's very much bolus treatment. And so when we look at anatomic control or CST, we see the CST goes down, then back up, and then down again as patients are treated. And so there's almost this sawtooth pattern. And so it was really interesting to look at CST change from baseline in both the control arm and then also the EYP-1901 arms because you didn't see that sawtooth pattern in the EYP-1901 arms. There was just consistent anatomical control throughout. Additionally, when we look at supplemental injections for patients in the EYP-1901 groups, over 80% of EYP-1901 treated eyes actually received 0 or 1 supplemental injections during the study period. So I think that's pretty impressive when you think about treatment burden and how important decreasing that is for our patients.
Explain how EYP-1901 works differently than standard anti-VEGF agents, and what does that broader mechanism translate to in terms of how much supplemental treatment patients might actually need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we look at EYP-1901, this is a vorolanib intravitreal insert, and it has a multi-mechanism of action pathway. So it inhibits VEGF. There's pan-VEGF inhibition. It also inhibits PDGF and also has anti-IL-6 activity. And so what that means is it's acting on multiple pathways: angiogenesis via the VEGF pathway, inflammation via IL-6 inhibition, inhibition, and then also anti-fibrotic effect via inhibiting PDGF. And so you think about, all the different things that contribute to vision loss in neovascular AMD, and this is a very broad spectrum approach to that. The implications are great. So when you think about this intravitreal drug delivery technology, there's consistent daily dosing with target inhibition of those pathways that I mentioned for at least 6 months, likely more. And so when we think about treatment burden for our neovascular AMD patients, there's great potential there. And there's also a lot of potential in terms of efficacy because we're targeting parts of the neovascular AMD pathophysiology that we really haven't before.
In the real world, patients often don't get treated as often as trials recommend. How much of that comes down to the injection schedule itself versus other barriers like getting to appointments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that there is a large component of it where there are these real world factors, right? In terms of being able to get to appointments. When we look at treatment burden in the real world with some of the larger data sets that we have, we know that, a lot of our patients are getting injections every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks. Over time, that's not really sustainable. And I think a lot of the latter factors that you mentioned in terms of transportation, and then also just overall systemic health. This is an older patient population. They have other comorbidities. It's, often that I hear from my patients, well, I was in the hospital or I had other doctor's appointments. So all these factors come into play when we think about treatment in the real world and why durability is so important for this patient population.